The Croatia SuperUnited Rapid and Blitz event has concluded today with Fabiano Caruana taking first place and winning $40,000 with 27 points and a massive lead over the second place contenders. In second place, we have a three-way tie with Wesley, MVL, and Alireza Firouzja, all with 8.33 points, winning $25,000 each. The first game we're going to be looking at is Levon Aronian versus Gukesh. The game went e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, knight c3, knight d4, e5. We've seen this a few times so far in this event. Knight d5, castles, a6, c4. Knight b4, jumping into this newly created weakness, potential weakness. Knight back to c3, d6, e takes d, queen takes d. We don't want to open up this e file. Instead, we want to create more pressure on the light squares in this d3 square. Knight e4, queen d3, hopping right into that weakness. Knight takes c5, queen takes c4, d4 supporting the knight, getting the bishop out, preparing some sort of rook c1 with tempo on the queen. And white has a massive lead in development here with almost no drawbacks. Queen c2, trying to trade, queen e1, knight d5. Black's king is going to have a lot of trouble castling here, and if he does not manage to castle, it's going to be a rough time. So bishop d2, again, wanting to bring more pieces into the game with tempo. e6 gives an exclam, but you have to get your pieces out. Rook c1, queen takes b2, queen e5. I think that this move is a very nice one because now the dark squared bishop still cannot move without hanging the g7 pawn. So f6 is semi-forced, and after queen h5 check, g6, the queen goes back to h3. And the issue here is black has just made more weaknesses and is still pretty much no closer to castling. Meanwhile, every single one of white's pieces is developed, and something like e5 with a tempo on the queen might look semi-enticing at first, but after queen h4, black will fall apart after d takes e5. No matter what is played in this position, white's going to break open the center, put a rook on e1, and break through. So something like e5 doesn't actually do anything. So instead, bishop takes c5. This is a good move because it's getting closer to castling with tempo. White has to respond by recapturing. And king f7 is played. And by the way, when I say castling, I just mean getting the king safe. I don't literally mean castling. So king f7, which allows the immediate rook c1. Queen b6 coming back to try and cover some of these weak squares. And g4 exclam. The point of this move is to simply break open the king even further and create more lines, and perhaps use the dark squared bishop that black is lacking to attack the king. Queen d8, g5, breaking open the king, e5, a counterattack on the queen, and white simply played queen h4 here, b6, and this move is just trying to kick that rook away from this annoying square, but now c6 has been weakened, so the c6 square is available, and now all these weakened squares on the 6th rank are accessible. So e4, and now Levon plays the brilliant move, rook takes f6 check, sacrificing the exchange. And after knight takes f6, we don't recapture, we play knight e5, king e6, queen h3, king e7. Now we take on f6, bring the other rook into c6, and this is all very forced. And here there's a choice. This wins the queen, and it's very strong, but even better is the move bishop b4, and black resigned on the spot. And the point is, you're actually winning the queen, but even more than that, after king e8, rook e6 check, the king is out of squares. So bishop takes e6 is forced, queen takes, the king is still out of squares, and queen e7, queen takes e7 would be checkmate, and you win the queen. So instead, Gukesh just resigned. The second game we're going to look at is MVL versus Levon Aronian. e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop e4, takes, bishop d3. This is just like an exchange French position. c6, knight e2, knight e7, knight g3, knight d2, castle, castle, knight e2. And these positions can get dangerous for black. the exchange French is known for being sort of drawn and or equal, but even in some of my games, I've ended up sacrificing pieces and trying to checkmate the black king. All right, knight f4, g6. This does something. It protects these squares around the king and tries to keep the white pieces away, but it also weakens the dark squares around the king, which could be a huge mistake. Queen f3 is played, and the only reason queen f3 is a mistake is because white could have played rook or knight f to h5 right away and sacrificed this piece, which, spoilers, does happen. It just, MVL wanted to get all of his pieces in the game first, which is a good practical decision. So queen f3, knight f8, c3, bishop d2, and rook e1. So now that all of our pieces are developed and ready to attack, this is the time to strike. So knight c8, knight g to h5, and it calls it a mistake, but it's not because it's a bad sacrifice. It's a brilliant sacrifice. Black actually cannot take. Instead, should play something like knight b6 and just try and hang on. But after g takes h5, black is completely lost. So knight takes h5, and now we're seeing these dark squares around the king really come under pressure. The g file is open, and the bishops are absolute monsters. So knight g6, trying to cover up, but knight f6 check. And yeah, you could win the rook if you wanted to, but after king g7, better is just bishop g5, again, piling up on these dark squares, threatening knight h5 check, winning the queen. And so what else is black to do but play bishop e7, covering these things? And interestingly, the move queen takes f6 is being recommended in a few positions here. I think even here, black should play the move queen takes f6, if that shows you how bad this is for black. So, okay, but that's not human. So knight g7, or king g7, bishop g4, bishop e7, rook takes e6. And this is a brilliant rook sacrifice. And the point is to weaken all of the light squares around the king. Number one, it gets rid of a defender, but more importantly, it's weakening this knight. And at first I thought the point was something knight h7 related, but this is just too slow because the bishop on g5 is hanging. If king takes h7, this would work with queen f7, and then, where's my mate? I guess just bishop takes g6 and queen h7. But this allows bishop takes g4, and actually white would be lost. So instead, it's followed up by yet another piece sacrifice, bishop h6, double exclam. So, okay, there's a lot going on here. Well, first look, if you take the bishop, queen h5, check, king g7 is forced, queen h7, check, and if you go back to f8, then queen g8 is checkmate, so king takes f6, but queen g6 is actually also checkmate. This is such a beautiful mating pattern that I actually have not seen before. So instead of taking that bishop, Levon plays king h8, but now knight takes h7, another piece sacrifice. And of course you cannot take because of queen f7, and king takes h6 is lose to checkmate, and again this also is checkmate. So you can't take the knight, it's not really a sacrifice. Rook g8, trying to cover up some of these squares around the king, but queen h5 coming into the only thing that matters, which is the king. Queen e8, knight f6, hanging another piece. And of course, if you take on f6, there's bishop f8, checkmate in 1. So you cannot take the knight. Knight f4 is played, attacking the queen, so if bishop f8 now, you can just take on h5. So bishop g7. The pieces don't actually ever have to be defended if your attack is strong enough. And so the point here is king takes g7 is forced because this is a double check, and knight takes e8 now is check. So black doesn't have time to pick up the queen. So king f8, queen h6, picking up the knight, and a few moves are played, and black ends up resigning here. So a very, very impressive game by MVL with lots of very cool sacrifices. The final game I wanted to look at was in the final round of the event. Fabiano Caruana, the leader of the tournament, and also he actually won the event with 5 games left to be played. So theoretically, he could have just lost his last 5 games and still won the whole event. But that didn't stop him. He still did very, very well in these final 5 games. And he played Levon Aronian with the white pieces. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, g3, c5, d5, takes, d6, knight c3. And the general idea in this structure for white is to plant a knight on this c4 square and maybe pile up on the d6 pawn and play in the center. Things like that, to my understanding. Bishop g2, bishop g7, knight f3, castle, rook e8, bishop f4, bishop f5, knight h4, forcing the bishop back, and rook e1. So rook e1 is showing the intention of pushing in the center, I believe. So knight g4, knight back to f3, knight d7, bishop g5. The commentators were suspicious of this move because they thought that it forced the queen to just a good square on b6, but Fabi had other plans. So queen c1, and we got this bishop to this active square with a tempo. We defend b2 while trying to make things happen on the dark squares. Knight e5, h3, knight takes f3, e takes f3, opening this e file now. Rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and knight back to f6, which is just a blunder. Levon missed the move queen e7 here, which just wins because the knight is attacked twice. It can't be defended. It has to move. And also there are back rank problems. So if something like queen takes b2, an active move threatening to take the rook here, queen d8, we're not going to take on f6. We're going to play queen d8 check. And if, of course, if knight e8, we take bishop f8 and then bishop h6 and black resigns. So instead, bishop f8, yeah, and here bishop takes f6 can be played. And just hang this rook on a1 with check, king h2. So after queen c1, something like this, trying to get back in through h6, white just will bring in another piece. And we've seen patterns like this before. This pin on the back rank is just lethal. And something like bishop e7 could come in. Potentially you could even build up on f7. So this would also be completely winning for white. Instead, Levon played knight d7 here, which was followed up by queen e8 check instantly, knight f8, and rook e1, bringing in that other rook to the game. Queen takes b2, knight e4, bringing in the final piece. Queen d4, knight takes d6, and now f7 is a target. Queen takes d5, knight takes c8, and white is just up material. It is only an exchange, but this knight is not playing. These pieces are as active as they can be. White's king is safe. And this eventually was just a win for Fabi. So taking a look at our final standings once again, a big congratulations to Fabiano Caruana, who won first place with 27 points, winning $40,000. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.